The stars hung like ancient lanterns in the velvet expanse of space, their light whispering secrets to those who dared listen. On a desolate moon orbiting an unremarkable gas giant, humanity's last bastion stood defiant against the encroaching darkness. The outpost was a jagged scar upon the lunar landscape, its titanium walls shimmering with frost from the perpetual night. Inside, the air thrummed with tension as soldiers moved through corridors that echoed with both purpose and unease. Among them was Captain Elias Voss, whose name had become legend among his peers, not for his rank but for what he carried within him, an unshakable resolve forged in fire and shadow. His uniform bore the marks of countless battles, patches hastily sewn over tears where alien claws or plasma bursts had come too close. But it wasn't just his scars that set him apart, it was something deeper, something no one could quite articulate. There was a gravity about him, a quiet intensity that drew people toward him even as they instinctively stepped back. It wasn't charisma, it was presence. A kind of power that didn't need words to command respect. Elias's boots clicked sharply against the metallic floor as he strode through the narrow hallways, flanked by two junior officers clutching data slates filled with intelligence reports. Their faces were pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, eyes darting nervously at every sound, the low hum of machinery, the occasional crackle of static from comm units. They weren't afraid of dying. Death had long since lost its sting on this forsaken rock. No, what gnawed at them was uncertainty. Rumors had spread faster than any official briefing ever could. The aliens were coming, not in small raiding parties but in numbers vast enough to blot out the horizon. And worse still, whispers spoke of their queen being among them. Elias stopped abruptly outside the war room, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular yet somehow encompassing everything. He dismissed the officers with a curt nod before stepping inside. The chamber was dimly lit, tactical maps projected onto holographic displays that flickered erratically. Around the table sat key members of his team, men and women whose loyalty ran deeper than blood, but tonight, none met his eyes directly. They knew why he was here. Everyone did. The coordinates? Elias asked without preamble, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. Commander Taryn leaned forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the projection. Confirmed. Sector 12 Beta. Ground forces estimated at 30,000 strong. Air support, unknown. She hesitated, swallowing hard. And intel suggests she's leading them personally. Heads bowed lower around the table. The implications didn't need to be spoken aloud. If the Queen herself led the assault, then this wasn't merely another skirmish. This was annihilation, or conquest. Either way, survival seemed unlikely. Elias studied the map, tracing invisible lines across the terrain with his eyes. 30,000. Against what remained of Earth's fleet, a ragtag assembly of survivors cobbled together after years of retreat. Hope felt like a cruel joke in moments like these, but hope was all they had left. He turned away from the display, surveying the faces of those gathered. Each carried burdens heavier than armor, fears sharper than blades. Yet there was also determination etched into their features, a stubborn refusal to surrender despite overwhelming odds. "Prepare the barracks," Elias ordered finally, his tone firm but devoid of bravado. "Double shifts on perimeter defenses. I want every soldier armed to the teeth and ready to move at dawn." No one questioned him. Orders given, he exited the room, leaving behind a palpable sense of foreboding. As he walked alone through the labyrinthine halls once more, his thoughts drifted, not to strategies or battle plans, but to memories buried deep beneath layers of duty and sacrifice. Memories of home, of laughter echoing through sunlit fields, of hands held tightly in promise. Those days felt like relics now, artifacts from a time when humanity still believed itself invincible. Yet amidst the weight pressing down on his shoulders, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental loomed ahead, not merely defeat or victory but something far greater, something beyond comprehension. Something waiting for him beyond the fog of war. The first tremors began shortly before sunrise, subtle vibrations rippling through the outpost's foundation like the distant drumbeat of an approaching storm. At first, the soldiers dismissed them as natural phenomena, perhaps tectonic shifts beneath the moon's crust. But as the quakes grew stronger, shaking loose dust from the ceilings and causing equipment to clatter ominously, reality sank in with chilling clarity. The enemy was here. Elias stood atop the western battlement, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon where shadows stretched impossibly long under the twin moons' glow. What he saw made his breath hitch, not because of fear but because of awe. The alien horde emerged from the darkness like a living tide, their forms sleek and otherworldly, exoskeletons glinting faintly with iridescent hues. They moved with eerie synchronicity, each step deliberate, measured, as though choreographed by some unseen conductor. Among them towered constructs of biomechanical design, their spindly limbs bristling with weaponry capable of reducing entire buildings to ash. But it wasn't the sheer size of the force that froze Elias's blood. It was the figure at its center. She came into view slowly, carried aloft on a levitating dais that pulsed with an ethereal blue light. Her presence commanded attention, not through aggression but through sheer magnetism. The alien queen was unlike anything Elias, or anyone else, had ever encountered. Towering above her warriors, her form was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Her body shimmered with translucent scales that refracted the dim light into prismatic colors, while tendrils resembling liquid metal cascaded down her sides, writhing gently as if alive. Her face, if it could be called that, was a symphony of organic curves and sharp angles, crowned by crystalline protrusions that caught the faintest hint of starlight. But it was her eyes that truly unsettled him. They weren't windows to a soul, they were voids, infinite and unknowable, pulling everything they touched into their abyssal depths. For a moment, time seemed to halt. The soldiers lining the battlements froze mid-motion, rifles lowered as if forgotten. Even Elias found himself immobilized, his grip slackening on the binoculars until they nearly slipped from his grasp. There was something profoundly wrong about how she moved, how she existed. It defied logic, physics, even instinct. And yet, paradoxically, there was also beauty in her presence, a terrible majesty that demanded reverence rather than resistance. Then she stopped. The procession ground to a halt, the silence between beats deafening. Every alien warrior turned toward their queen, bowing in unison as though pulled by invisible strings. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, without warning, she raised one elongated arm, pointing directly at the outpost. Or rather, not at the outpost. At Elias. His chest tightened as realization dawned. He wasn't imagining it. Her gaze was locked onto him, piercing through kilometers of distance and fortified walls as if they didn't exist. The sensation was indescribable, like standing too close to a supernova, overwhelmed by its brilliance yet unable to look away. Panic bubbled up inside him, but he forced it down, gripping the edge of the battlement to steady himself. Whatever was happening, he couldn't afford weakness. Not now, not ever. And then, impossibly, she knelt. The entire battlefield seemed to hold its collective breath as the alien queen bent her immense frame forward, lowering herself until her forehead nearly touched the ground. Her warriors followed suit, prostrating themselves en masse, creating a sea of bowed bodies that stretched endlessly across the barren landscape. The sight was surreal, almost sacrilegious, given everything humanity knew about these creatures. They were conquerors, destroyers, beings whose very existence seemed predicated on domination. Yet here they were, submitting, not to humanity, not to the outpost, but to him. Elias's mind raced, grappling for explanations. Was this some elaborate ruse? A psychological tactic meant to destabilize morale? Or worse, was it a prelude to attack, designed to lull them into complacency before unleashing hellfire? None of it made sense. Nothing about her actions aligned with their understanding of the enemy. And yet, deep down, he felt certain of one thing. Whatever this was, it wasn't deception. There was sincerity in her gesture, a raw, unfiltered truth that transcended language or species. The world around him blurred, narrowing to just her and him, separated by leagues yet connected by something intangible. He wanted to shout orders, to rally his troops, to do something, but his voice refused to obey. Instead, he stood rooted to the spot, watching as the queen slowly rose, her movements fluid and deliberate. Once upright, she extended her arm again, palm open in what might have been interpreted as a gesture of peace, or invitation. Behind him, chaos erupted. Soldiers broke formation, shouting questions, demanding answers. Commanders barked conflicting orders, trying to regain control. Yet none of it mattered anymore. All eyes were on Elias, waiting for him to act, to provide clarity in the face of incomprehensible ambiguity. But how could he lead when he himself had no idea what was happening? As the minutes dragged on, the Queen remained motionless, her luminous gaze unwavering. The standoff stretched into eternity, each heartbeat pounding louder than the last. Somewhere in the distance, the faint whine of alien engines signaled reinforcements arriving, but Elias barely registered the sound. His focus was absolute, his thoughts consumed by a single, burning question. Why me? The air thickened with anticipation, heavy as a storm cloud poised to burst. Elias descended from the battlements, his boots striking the cold steel floors with resolute precision. Around him, soldiers scrambled to prepare for what might come next. Whether battle or parley, no one dared guess. Yet Elias moved with singular purpose, drawn inexorably toward the main gate. His decision hadn't been debated or second-guessed, it simply was. To stay hidden behind walls would be tantamount to cowardice, and besides, the Queen's gesture had shifted the axis of the conflict. Retreat was no longer an option. Commander Taryn intercepted him halfway, her face etched with worry. "Sir, you can't go out there alone. It's suicide." Elias paused, meeting her gaze with an intensity that silenced further protest. "If I don't, we lose our chance to understand why they're here. Why she's here." Taryn opened her mouth to argue but thought better of it. Instead, she nodded grimly, signaling two snipers stationed nearby to take positions overlooking the gate. Their rifles gleamed faintly in the dim light, barrels trained on the horizon where the alien host waited. Elias acknowledged them with a curt glance before continuing onward, his pulse steady despite the turmoil swirling within him. When the massive doors groaned open, the frigid lunar wind rushed in, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of alien technology. Elias stepped through, emerging into the stark, barren expanse that separated humanity's stronghold from the invaders. The contrast was jarring, the outpost's angular architecture behind him, all sharp edges and utilitarian design, versus the alien horde arrayed before him, flowing like liquid mercury under the wan glow of the twin moons. And at its heart stood the Queen, still unmoving, her luminous form radiating an aura that seemed almost sacred. Elias took one step, then another, his strides deliberate, unyielding. With each footfall, the silence deepened, stretching taut like a bowstring ready to snap. The soldiers manning the walls watched in stunned disbelief, their weapons lowered but not holstered. Behind them, murmurs rippled through the ranks, voices hushed yet urgent. Questions flew like shrapnel. What was he doing? Why wasn't he armed? Did he even know what he was walking into? He did. And he didn't. What Elias understood was simple. This moment transcended strategy or survival. Whatever bond or curse had formed between him and the Queen, it was beyond human comprehension. To meet her halfway was less an act of diplomacy and more an inevitability, as if some cosmic thread had been woven between them long before either side set foot on this desolate moon. Still, doubt clawed at the edges of his mind. Was he being reckless? Foolish? Or was this precisely what needed to happen? The distance closed rapidly, each step bringing new details into focus. Up close, the Queen's scale-like carapace shimmered with intricate patterns that shifted subtly, as though alive. Her tendrils swayed gently, emitting faint pulses of light that synchronized with the rhythm of his heartbeat. It unnerved him, how attuned she seemed to his presence, as if reading him like an open book. But there was no malice in her posture, no threat in her stance. Only patience. Waiting. Finally, he stopped, mere meters away, the boundary between worlds marked only by the empty space between them. For a moment, neither moved nor spoke. The universe itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, Elias raised his hands, palms outward in a universal gesture of peace. His voice, when it came, was steady but soft, carried by the wind rather than amplified by bravado. "I am Captain Elias Voss," he said, speaking not just to the Queen but to the thousands of alien warriors arrayed behind her. "You've brought your army to my doorstep. Tell me why." There was no immediate response. The Queen tilted her head slightly, studying him with those abyssal eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone alike. Time stretched interminably, each second weighted with unspoken possibilities. Then, with a grace that belied her size, she extended one slender appendage, touching the ground lightly before sweeping it upward in a fluid arc. The movement triggered something, a ripple of energy that coalesced into a shape hovering just above the surface. It was a hologram, though unlike any Elias had ever seen. The image resolved into a panorama of stars, galaxies swirling in breathtaking detail. Within the tapestry floated a single planet, vibrant and teeming with life. Earth. As the projection rotated, the scene shifted, showing cities crumbling, oceans boiling, skies choked with ash. Humanity's downfall unfolded in vivid, horrifying clarity. Elias staggered back a step, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't propaganda or manipulation. It was prophecy. A vision of what awaited if the war continued unchecked. His fists clenched involuntarily, nails digging into his palms. How dare she show him this? How dare she presume to dictate humanity's fate? But the hologram didn't stop there. Another image appeared, overlaying the first, a new Earth, green and thriving, its skies clear, its oceans calm. Between the two visions hovered a symbol, pulsing faintly, a circle intersected by 3 lines forming a triangular pattern. It was unfamiliar yet hauntingly familiar, stirring something buried deep within his subconscious. Before Elias could process what he was seeing, the Queen spoke. Not in words, but in sensations, waves of emotion crashing over him like tidal forces. Compassion, resolve, sacrifice. Each feeling resonated with startling clarity, bypassing language entirely. She wasn't condemning humanity, she was offering salvation. But salvation came with conditions, choices that would test the limits of courage and conviction. Elias swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze once more. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the roaring in his ears. In response, the Queen reached out again, this time extending her hand toward him. Her meaning was unmistakable. Join her. Walk alongside her. Be part of whatever destiny she envisioned. The offer was intoxicating, seductive even, promising absolution from guilt and grief. Yet it also demanded surrender, not just of arms but of identity, autonomy, everything that made humanity human. Behind him, shouts erupted from the outpost. Soldiers screamed warnings, urging him to retreat, to reconsider. Some fired warning shots into the air, their panic palpable. But Elias ignored them, his focus locked solely on the Queen. He knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever choice he made in this moment would define not only his own future but the fate of billions. And so he stood, suspended between worlds, torn between duty and destiny, knowing full well that the path forward offered no guarantees, only questions. The weight of the Queen's gesture lingered heavily in the air, settling over Elias like an invisible mantle. Her offer, conveyed without words yet imbued with profound clarity, demanded more than mere acquiescence. It required transformation. Standing there, bathed in the ghostly luminescence of her presence, Elias felt the boundaries of his identity begin to blur. He was no longer just a soldier, a leader, or even a representative of humanity. In her eyes, he was something greater, something undefined, and the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Around him, the alien warriors stirred, their movements synchronized yet fluid, as though they were extensions of a single organism. Their deference to the Queen was absolute, their loyalty unshakable. Yet, as Elias scanned their ranks, he noticed something peculiar. They weren't looking at him with hostility or disdain. Instead, their gazes carried a mixture of curiosity and reverence, as if recognizing in him a reflection of their own devotion to their sovereign. It was disorienting, this duality of being both adversary and chosen. One moment perceived as an enemy, the next elevated to a status bordering on divine. Elias glanced back toward the outpost, where the silhouettes of his comrades lined the walls, their expressions obscured but their emotions palpable. Fear, anger, confusion, all simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. They trusted him implicitly, relying on his judgment to guide them through the chaos. But how could he lead them when he himself was adrift, caught between worlds that refused to align? The burden of command had always been heavy, but now it felt insurmountable, dragging him down into depths he wasn't sure he could navigate. Turning his attention inward, Elias confronted the swirling maelstrom of his own psyche. Doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve, whispering insidious truths he couldn't ignore. Could he abandon humanity for the sake of survival? Was such a trade worth making? And if he accepted the Queen's offer, what would remain of him afterward? Would he still recognize himself, or would he become a stranger wearing his skin? Yet intertwined with these doubts was a burgeoning sense of purpose, fragile but undeniable. The Queen's vision of a renewed Earth resonated deeply, igniting a spark of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Perhaps this was why he had survived so many battles, endured so much loss, not merely to fight but to bridge the chasm between species, to forge a future where neither side had to perish. If he could stand as a mediator, a conduit between humanity and the alien collective, then maybe, just maybe, he could rewrite the narrative of endless destruction. The internal struggle manifested physically, his body rigid with tension as conflicting impulses warred within him. His fists clenched and unclenched, betraying the turmoil raging beneath his stoic exterior. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to return to the safety of the outpost and fortify against the inevitable onslaught. But another voice, quieter yet persistent, urged him to step forward, to embrace the unknown and see where it led. Time seemed to stretch infinitely, each heartbeat echoing like thunder in the silence. The Queen remained patient, her luminous gaze unwavering, as though granting him the space to wrestle with his demons. She didn't press, didn't demand compliance. Her posture radiated calm assurance, as if she already knew the outcome before it unfolded. And then, amidst the cacophony of doubt and possibility, Elias experienced a fleeting moment of clarity. He realized that the choice before him wasn't binary, acceptance or rejection, but rather a spectrum of potential paths. By stepping forward, he wouldn't be surrendering to the Queen's will but forging a third way, one that honored both his humanity and the responsibilities thrust upon him. It was a gamble, fraught with uncertainty, but it offered a chance to transcend the cycle of violence that had defined their existence thus far. Taking a deep breath, Elias straightened his spine, squaring his shoulders as though preparing for battle. His decision crystallized not in words but in action. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his arms, letting them hang loosely at his sides. Then, with measured steps, he moved closer to the Queen, closing the remaining distance until he stood directly before her. The air crackled with energy, charged with the significance of the moment. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the Queen inclined her head slightly, her crystalline crown catching the faint light. A tendril extended toward him, brushing lightly against his chest, not as an act of dominance but as a gesture of connection. The sensation was electric, sending shivers coursing through his body. It wasn't invasion, it was communion. Through the touch, Elias glimpsed fragments of her consciousness, flashes of memories and emotions that transcended language. He saw the vastness of her empire, the millennia-spanning legacy of her people, and the sorrow that accompanied their expansion, a sorrow born of necessity rather than cruelty. In that instant, Elias understood. The Queen's submission wasn't an act of subservience but of recognition. She saw in him not just a soldier but a kindred spirit, someone who embodied the same qualities she revered: resilience, adaptability, and an unyielding commitment to survival. And perhaps, buried deep within her motives, lay a desire for redemption, for absolution from the countless lives sacrificed in pursuit of her people's ascension. As the tendril withdrew, Elias felt a shift within himself. The weight of leadership no longer crushed him but buoyed him, lifting him toward a horizon previously obscured by despair. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead promised to be fraught with peril. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe that survival didn't have to mean sacrifice, that coexistence, however improbable, might yet be possible. Standing there, bathed in the glow of the alien horde and the watchful eyes of his comrades, Elias Voss embraced the role fate had thrust upon him. Whatever came next, he would face it, not as a pawn of destiny but as its architect. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, as Elias stood before the alien Queen. Her luminous form loomed over him, yet there was no malice in her presence, only an overwhelming sense of purpose. The tendril that had touched his chest retracted slowly, leaving behind a faint warmth that radiated through his body like the afterglow of sunlight on skin. It wasn't intrusive. It felt more like a seal being forged, an unspoken agreement between two beings who existed on opposite sides of existence yet were bound by something far greater. Elias took a step back, his boots crunching softly against the lunar dust. He turned slightly, glancing toward the outpost where humanity's remnants watched with bated breath. Their faces were etched with fear, confusion, and desperation, a mosaic of emotions reflecting the fractured state of their species. For a fleeting second, doubt clawed at him again. What right did he have to make this decision for them? To gamble their future on the fragile hope that coexistence was possible? But then he remembered the holographic vision she had shown him, Earth reduced to ash versus Earth reborn, verdant and whole. The choice seemed clear when framed in such stark terms, but the path to reach that renewal was anything but simple. If he accepted her offer, if he stepped into the unknown alongside her, what would it cost? And could humanity ever forgive him, or trust her, for the atrocities already committed? The Queen moved first, breaking the tension with deliberate grace. She extended one elongated arm once more, palm open, inviting rather than commanding. This time, however, she didn't stop there. With a fluid motion, she gestured toward the outpost, her tendrils shimmering as they swept across the horizon. The message was clear. Come. Bring them. Elias hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect his people and the realization that staying behind those fortified walls would only prolong the inevitable. Humanity couldn't win this war, not conventionally. Not without sacrificing everything they sought to preserve. Yet abandoning their stronghold felt like surrender, even if the Queen's intentions appeared genuine. How could he ask his soldiers, his comrades, to follow him into the heart of the enemy's domain? Before he could fully process his next move, a voice crackled over his comm unit. It was Commander Taryn, her tone urgent but controlled. "Captain, we've got movement on the scanners. More ships incoming. Looks like reinforcements." Elias cursed under his breath. The window of opportunity was closing faster than he'd anticipated. If he didn't act now, the chance for dialogue might vanish entirely, swallowed by the chaos of battle. He glanced back at the Queen, searching her inscrutable gaze for any sign of deception. There was none, only patience, and perhaps a flicker of understanding, as though she recognized the weight of his dilemma. "Stand down," Elias said firmly into the comm, his voice carrying authority despite the turmoil within him. "Hold your positions. No hostile actions unless provoked." Taryn's response was immediate, laced with disbelief. "Sir, you can't be serious. You're out there alone with—" "I'm aware of my situation," Elias interrupted, cutting her off before she could finish. "Trust me, Commander. Just hold." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a resigned sigh. "Understood, sir. But if this goes south—" "It won't," Elias replied, though the conviction in his voice wavered slightly. He ended the transmission, turning his full attention back to the Queen. She hadn't moved during the exchange, her posture calm and regal, exuding a quiet confidence that somehow steadied his nerves. Taking another deep breath, Elias made his decision. Slowly, he raised his hand, mirroring her gesture. His fingers trembled faintly, but his resolve was firm. "If I come with you," he said aloud, knowing she would understand even if his words were lost to her, "you will not harm my people. Do you swear it?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, the Queen inclined her head once more, her crystalline crown catching the dim light. A wave of reassurance washed over him, not telepathic exactly, but visceral, as though her very presence carried the weight of an oath older than stars. It wasn't enough to erase all doubt, but it was enough to take the next step. Elias lowered his hand and began walking back toward the outpost, each stride heavy with purpose. Behind him, the Queen and her warriors remained still, watching with an almost reverent intensity. As he approached the gates, the soldiers stationed there tensed, weapons raised half-heartedly as if unsure whether to aim at him or the alien horde beyond. Their expressions ranged from shock to outright betrayal. "Open the gates," Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the murmurs of disbelief. When no one moved, he repeated himself, louder this time. "Now." Reluctantly, the massive doors groaned open, revealing the interior of the outpost. Soldiers spilled onto the ramparts, their faces pale with dread. Some called out to him, pleading for answers, while others simply stared in stunned silence. Elias ignored them, climbing the steps to the highest vantage point where Commander Taryn awaited him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What the hell are you doing?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're walking straight into a trap." "No," Elias countered, meeting her gaze with unwavering determination. "I'm ending this war." Taryn's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she nodded toward the assembled troops. "They won't follow you blindly, Elias. Not into this." "They don't have to," he replied. "But they need to trust me. Trust that I'm doing what's necessary to save us, all of us." Before she could respond, Elias turned to address the crowd. Hundreds of eyes locked onto him, filled with equal parts fear and hope. He let the silence hang for a moment, allowing the gravity of the situation to settle over them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of every sacrifice, every loss, and every dream they'd clung to in the face of annihilation. "This isn't about surrender," he began, his words ringing out across the compound. "It's about survival. About finding a way forward when none seems possible. I don't know what lies ahead, but I do know this. We cannot continue down the path we're on. If we fight, we die. If we hide, we die. But if we take this chance, if we dare to believe that peace is possible, then maybe, just maybe, we live." A murmur rippled through the ranks, growing louder as soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Some nodded reluctantly, while others shook their heads in defiance. Elias didn't expect unanimous agreement. He didn't need it. All he needed was enough faith to carry them through the uncertainty. With a final glance at Taryn, who gave him a curt nod of reluctant support, Elias descended the steps and walked back toward the Queen. This time, he wasn't alone. A small group of volunteers fell into step behind him, their faces grim but resolute. Among them were medics, engineers, and diplomats, people willing to risk everything for the slimmest chance at a better future. As they reached the edge of the outpost, the Queen greeted them with a sweeping gesture of acknowledgement. Her warriors parted to create a pathway, forming an honor guard of sorts as the humans passed through their ranks. The air thrummed with anticipation, charged with the potential for either catastrophe or salvation. Elias stopped just short of the Queen's dais, turning to face his companions. Each one met his gaze, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "we face it together." The Queen extended her hand once more, and this time Elias didn't hesitate. He placed his palm against hers, feeling the cool, smooth texture of her skin, or whatever passed for skin beneath her shimmering exoskeleton. A surge of energy coursed through him, bright and blinding, filling him with a sense of connection so profound it bordered on spiritual. And then, without warning, the world shifted. The landscape dissolved around them, replaced by a kaleidoscope of light and color that defied comprehension. They weren't traveling in the conventional sense. They were transcending space itself, moving through dimensions humanity had never dared to imagine. When the sensation subsided, they found themselves standing in a vast chamber unlike anything they'd ever seen. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, shifting and flowing like living tapestries. Strange flora grew in clusters, their petals glowing softly in hues of blue and gold. At the center of the room stood a towering structure, a spire of crystalline material that hummed with latent power. Around its base gathered figures both familiar and alien, representatives of countless species, each bearing the same look of awe and reverence that Elias and his companions now wore. The Queen stepped forward, addressing the assembly in a language that resonated not in ears but in souls. Her words, if they could be called that, spoke of unity, of shared destinies, and of the fragile balance required to maintain harmony among the stars. As she spoke, Elias felt the weight of his role settle fully upon him. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a bridge, a catalyst for change, tasked with guiding humanity toward a future they could scarcely comprehend. When the Queen finished, she turned to Elias, her abyssal eyes filled with something akin to gratitude. Then, with a single, graceful motion, she knelt before him once more. This time, however, the gesture carried a different meaning. It wasn't submission, it was alliance. Together, they would forge a new chapter in the story of the cosmos, one written not in blood but in hope. And so, amidst the glow of alien wonders and the promise of a brighter tomorrow, Elias Voss took his first step into a future neither human nor alien could have predicted, but one they would shape together.